MSL202, Lesson 02 on Analytical Skills and Avoiding Pitfalls. My name is Captain Silver Beatty. I'm an APMS at the University of Montana, and I'm going to be leading you through this lesson today. So before we start here, I want you to take a look at this. Go ahead and take a piece of paper out, or even just use your finger on your screen if you can. I want you to take some time, pause the video, and see if you can figure out how to connect all those dots without retracing or picking up your pen. Can you do it? Is there a way to make it happen? Right now, if that hurt your brain as much as it did me the first time I looked at this exercise, I got you. Now, this is the perfect example of thinking outside the box, right? If you were anything like me, you were trying to just stay inside that box, right? Right inside that square and figure out how to touch everything. It's not possible. You do have to think and take your pen outside the box in order to make this happen. So this is going to lead us into this lesson where we're really going to talk about critical thinking, using some different types of reasonings, different types of ways to analyze things, and then we're going to talk a little bit about biases and fallacies as well. So here are our learning objectives. This is a pretty long class, so be prepared for that. If you need to pause and go do something else, I just encourage you to come back because the last part of this lesson is pretty important. But to start off with, we're going to discuss those 3 basic thinking abilities. Then we're going to talk about 4 different types of reasoning. Then we're going to talk about structured analytical techniques, describing what it means to be a critical thinker. And like I said, then we're going to move right into fallacies and biases. So here are your 3 basic thinking abilities. What we think about with these, soldiers are required to utilize all kinds of different abilities and complex skills in order to analyze information. We expect that from students. We expect that from people in the civilian workforce. This is just part of being a human being in today's society. You have to be able to use different abilities and skills in order to analyze information correctly. With that, there are 3 basic thinking abilities that are required for analyzing that intelligence: information ordering, pattern recognition, and reasoning. Let's dive into those just a little bit more. And I did pull some words that might help make these make a little bit more sense for you. So when we're talking about information ordering, we're just talking about organizing our information. When we go into pattern recognition, now we're identifying different patterns within that information. And then when we move into reasoning, that's really just analyzing all of those patterns that we've found. So the textbook answer for this: information ordering is arranging data by defined rules in some sort of meaningful manner. Pattern recognition is going to be detecting and imposing patterns on entities and events to understand them. Again, just think about that word identifying. Detecting those patterns, identifying those patterns. And then reasoning is just the ability to process all that information and formulate your own explanations. So let's think about these a little bit more. How do we use information ordering as some sort of method of analysis? Well, like I just said, this is gathering that information and organizing it in some sort of way, right? So that's where we use it as our method for analyzing. With pattern recognition, why might you want to identify those patterns? Well, it'll probably help you come to reasonable conclusions when thinking about different things that are being thrown at you. You want to find those patterns. We'll discuss different types of structured analytical techniques, but pattern recognition is incredibly important. Find what commonly happens. Reasoning, well, when do we do this in ROTC? All the time, because if we're going back, reasoning is just analyzing that information, analyzing those patterns to make a decision going forward. This is something you will probably do in ROTC weekly, if not daily, if not in every single class that you're in. And then you can take this further, and obviously you're going to be using reasoning throughout your entire life as a student, as a worker, depending on, if you're a volunteer. You use these thinking abilities on a regular basis. You might just have not put technical terms to it. All right, so now that last one, reasoning. We're going to break this down a little bit more. There are 4 types of reasoning. And maybe you've heard of some of these before. You've probably heard deductive and inductive on a regular basis, but we also have abductive and analogical reasoning. So first I'm going to give you these textbook answers, and then we're going to break it down to a little bit more simplified way of thinking. So deductive reasoning is using given factual information or data to infer other facts through our logical thinking. Inductive reasoning is looking at that factual information or data for a pattern or maybe a trend, and then inferring that that trend will continue. Kind of using some assumptions with that. Abductive reasoning is a lot like inductive reasoning, since our conclusions are based on probabilities or educated guesses, if you will. And then analogical reasoning is probably something you use more often than you realize, where it's processing your information and it relies on an analogy to compare those similarities between two specific things. Now, I don't expect you to memorize exactly what the textbook answers for these are. This is how I actually want you to think of it. Deductive reasoning is just connecting the dots, right? You're basically connecting the dots with facts that you have to figure out more stuff, just using your brain power. So here's an example here. Imagine you're scrolling through your syllabus and it says that the final exam is cumulative. Now, cumulative means that it involves everything that you've learned over that semester, over that term. You also know that your professor has emphasized the importance of understanding the early concepts. So deductive reasoning means that you now realize you should probably focus on mastering those foundational materials because it's probably going to show up on your final. So that's deductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning, we're going to break down and simplify to just saying it's spotting patterns. So inductive reasoning is more like you're looking for patterns or trends in the info that you have, and then you're making generalizations or even predictions based on that. An example here is, let's say you've been crushing it in your assignments and you notice a pattern. Every time you use those epic study playlists, maybe that you have on Spotify or Apple Music, your grades are going up. So using that inductive reasoning, you figure out that music is your secret study weapon. It makes you that academic weapon, right? So now you're predicting that just jamming out to that same playlist while studying is your key to academic success. That's inductive reasoning in a nutshell. And moving into something that might be a little bit more confusing, or maybe even something that you haven't actually heard of before, abductive reasoning, we're just going to say is using your best guess. So you're taking your detective skills to come up with the most likely explanation, even if you don't have all the details. You're just making that best educated guess with the clues that you've got. So here I want you to picture this. You're at a party, your friend's missing. You see an empty pizza box, maybe some confetti, a trail of glitter. I know you're visualizing this. Instead of having all the facts, you just use abductive reasoning and guess that your friend may have joined a spontaneous pizza party in another room. Treat it like being a party detective, taking all those pieces, putting them together to solve that mystery. Now, analogical reasoning. This is something, like I said, you use on a regular basis and probably don't even realize it. So we're going to simplify this down to saying it's using life connections. You're going to connect the dots between different situations or different things to figure out how they're alike or similar. And then you're going to use that insight to understand or solve maybe a new situation. So here's an example. You're acing your video game strategy and suddenly you're asked to navigate a complex campus event. You might use analogical reasoning to realize that it's just like leveling up in a game. It requires planning and adapting. Tackling that campus event successfully needs a similar strategy. So it's just like applying your gaming skills to real life scenarios. What have you used in the past that has made you successful in a situation similar to the one that you're in right now? That's your analogical reasoning. So I want you to think about this now. We've talked about the thinking abilities and the different types of reasonings. Why might it be important for you to use reason when you're analyzing information? And how many of you have actually used inductive reasonings to join maybe ROTC? What facts did you use? And have you ever used an analogy to compare two things? What was that? You can pause the video here to start thinking about these a little bit more in depth or come back to it. Really just keep these questions in mind and see how you can apply that to experiences that you've already had. Now I want you to think about a time that you've had to develop maybe a hypothesis for some sort of research project. And if you haven't had to do this in the past, maybe think about how you would do it. If you've done it before, did the data that you found support your hypothesis? If not, what did you do? Did you go back? Did you decide that that hypothesis wasn't right and come up with a new one? Did you just submit it as is? So you have a guess of what's going to happen. That's the hypothesis, right? You're assuming or making a best guess of what you think will happen with certain things applied, different variables. Then you're going to pull that data over time and find out if you were correct. Now let's talk about our basic types of what we call structured analytical techniques. And again, I'm going to take some of these more complicated words and we're going to make them more simplified for you. So your basic types are sorting, matrices, and event mapping. Really, I want you to think of this in the way of, just like with your thinking abilities, you're going to categorize, then you're going to compare, and then visualize. Those are your 3 different types of structured analytical techniques. So the by the book answer would be, you use sorting for grouping information in order to develop different types of insights and facilitate your analysis. Matrices, you basically create a grid with as many cells as you need to sort data and gain some sort of insight and compare different things. And then event mapping is really just a brainstorming technique that's going to assist in diagramming your scenarios or different elements stemming from an analyst-derived hypothesis. So why might sorting be a reasonable method of analysis? What do you think? How might you use a matrix to analyze your information? And then when you think of event mapping and you think about comparing different scenarios, when have you used this technique in ROTC? If you haven't yet, when do you think you will? All right, so those are your structured analytical techniques. Now let's talk about critical thinking. This is one of the most important things that you need to be able to do as a leader in any type of field, because it's a deliberate process of analyzing and evaluating with a view to improve it. So you need to be thinking critically about just about everything that you're doing. It's a mental process and it's subject to a lot of different influences. And this is where that term analytical pitfalls, my goodness, comes in. All these influences we call analytical pitfalls, right? So those numerous influences that come in as you're thinking through things that we're about to talk about are split into 2 general categories. And those are fallacies and biases. And if you've been a part of any type of speech or debate team, you likely already know a lot about these and how to work around them or how to recognize them. But a lot of times we actually already carry some of these biases or use fallacies and don't even realize it. If you've ever read any type of news article anymore, or if you're watching the world and our political standpoints in the media, you're probably going to be able to identify a lot of different biases and fallacies used in different arguments. It's not only important to try your best to rid yourself and your thinking of these, but it's important to be able to identify them in somebody else's communication as well. So what role do you think critical thinking might play in your first assignment as a platoon leader? And how can critical thinking affect your own leadership philosophy? I also want you to think about how you can work to keep your own mind open to become a fair-minded critical thinker. And that part in there, fair-minded, is incredibly important because when we think critically, we do become more fair-minded. We lose our biases, we're not using fallacies, we become more fair-minded, more central in our thought process. So now let's talk about fallacies. These are considered a deceptive or misleading argument, especially one founded on false reasoning. They're not all the time malicious. Sometimes it's just what we do, or we're not even realizing that we're doing it. but they are a deceptive or misleading argument. And there are three types here. We have fallacies of relevance, which is pretty self-explanatory. There are evidence or examples that are completely irrelevant to the argument at hand. Then we've got fallacies of omission, where necessary material is left out of the conclusion or reference. You're leaving out necessary details in order to make your point. And then lastly, we've got our fallacies of assumption. This is kind of the opposite, where we're just implicitly or even explicitly involving assumptions that may or may not even be true and applying that to our argument. Now let's give you some examples of these. So an inductive fallacy, if we're going back to our types of reasonings here, I've seen 3 people wearing red shirts today. So everyone in this town must love the color red. You're using inductive reasoning, but it becomes a fallacy because it's not critically thought out. Now, an example of a deductive fallacy might be all students who wear glasses are smart. Sarah wears glasses, so she must be a genius. Now, if you've taken any kind of philosophy or theory classes, you've probably heard of the if-then. This falls under that. If all students who wear glasses are smart, then if Sarah wears glasses, she must be a genius. And then you've got your abductive fallacy there on the bottom. I found a black cat in the hallway, so there must be a witch living in our building who owns it. Makes sense, right? So while these are all silly and common sense examples, you can take a lot of things that you hear on a regular basis and reword them and probably find out that they are one of these fallacies, or they fall in some way, shape, or form a misleading or deceptive argument. So, as I mentioned a little bit ago, what type of fallacies have you seen used with advertising in our current media? Now let's talk about biases. This is a preconceived notion about someone or something. We all carry biases with us. It is nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, to not have some sort of bias within us and within our thinking. There are 4 main types here. So we talk about culture biases. This is just the inability to be able to see things through the eyes of someone from a different country or a different culture. Organizational is we have specific policy goals or even preconceived ideas within our organization. And if you take that one step further, an organizational bias is basically saying the way we do things is right, all the other ways are wrong. Now, personal biases are just basing our own assessments on our personal beliefs. So I believe this, and it's the only way to believe. And then our cognitive biases, this is the degree of reliability, completeness, or even consistency varies from our source to source. So if you look through these and really think about them, how do these different type of biases that we or our organizations hold, how does that make us less able to critically think through things? And how does it make us less fair-minded if we only believe what we believe and that all other ideas or notions are wrong? It can make it pretty difficult to make good decisions and fair-minded decisions for our people, right? So if we move these into different examples, an example of a cultural bias might be just assuming that everyone celebrates Christmas because maybe you've been in an environment that everybody does celebrate Christmas. But the truth is, as a leader, you'll find out anywhere you go, not everyone celebrates Christmas. They may not celebrate any type of holiday in the winter. They might celebrate other types of holidays. So a cultural bias is our culture or your culture might celebrate Christmas, but somebody else might not. Now, organizational biases, let's say you're in your classroom right now and you're sitting in tables. An example of this would be preferring your table's ideas over another table's in any kind of classroom discussion. Now, you might be right, your table's ideas might be right, but if we automatically go into a situation where we assume that our group's ideas are right and that group's ideas are wrong, we're automatically putting a barrier up or a wall where we're not open to other ideas. An example of a personal bias, we might assume Nike is the best brand because it's the first type of shoe you ever purchased. So automatically, Nike is the best brand. They've got the best sweats, the best socks, the best soccer balls, the best everything because you liked that one pair of shoes that you bought. This can keep you from being open to buying On Clouds or Hoka's or any type of, Under Armour sweatshirt because you have already convinced yourself that Nike is the best brand. So that's a personal bias. And then cognitive, this is one that really gets people in trouble. This is believing that a new idea is bad because it challenges your long-held beliefs. Now, this cognitive bias is also known as confirmation bias, which you've probably heard a lot over the last few years. When you have a confirmation bias, that also creates what we call echo chambers, where you are only trying to find platforms or people or information from sources that believe the same thing you do. When we do this and we get stuck in this frame of having these cognitive biases, we're not only not allowing other ideas to come into our brain, we're cutting them off completely to where it's not even possible for you to hear or process any type of other information because you're going to sources that only believe what you believe. And that's what we call an echo chamber, right? We see a lot of echo chambers on things like social media where you might only follow people or organizations that believe what you do. And there's nothing wrong with creating a network or being part of a network of people that believe what you do. But I do encourage you to think about listening and watching and understanding, at least trying to understand ideas from people that believe differently than you. We call this civil discourse, where you can sit and have a conversation with somebody who has the opposite opinion of you, find some middle ground, or at least hear each other out so that you understand the perspectives of where somebody else is coming from. And who knows, your beliefs might change. I can tell you that the things I believed 10 years ago are not the same as what I believe now. And 10 years from now, I will probably have different beliefs. But that's because I am constantly trying to look at things from other people's and other organizations' perspectives so that I can truly come to my own truth. Right, so think about this for yourself, and it might be a little uncomfortable, but what personal biases have you demonstrated or even thought of before? And maybe what types of cultural biases have you seen used? And now that you've been through all this information, how can we as an organization limit those culture biases within our own military? Those can be kind of heavy questions, but you are in the prime spot in your career to start thinking these things through now so that when you're ready to stand up with that gold bar on, you can lead in a way that uses critical thinking and uses these different processes to really analyze information in a fair-minded way. So that kind of answers that question there of how you might use this class in the future as an Army officer. I encourage you to start today. Once you exit out of this video, I want you to start thinking about your different biases that you might hold. Maybe different biases that your own university holds and your program holds. How is that either affecting in a negative or a positive way your ability to critically think through things? And then all of this information, how does it reinforce the Army's focus on developing the leadership for tomorrow's Army? How do we continue to get better? How do we continue to create and facilitate and, foster an environment of looking at different perspectives, challenging our own ideas and beliefs, and getting rid of as much as possible the biases that we already hold? All right, so in summary, I'm going to break all these down for you. You can take a screenshot, you can take a picture of this. This might help you move through a lot of things. But we talked about some heavy stuff today with a lot of different technical terms, right? We've talked about thinking abilities. We've talked about our 4 types of reasoning. We've talked about the different analytical techniques, the different fallacies, and all of our different biases. So this is where all those are. For thinking abilities, you've got your information ordering, pattern recognition, and reasoning. And then when you move into your types of reasoning, you've got deductive, inductive, abductive, and analogical. For your analytical techniques, you've got sorting, matrices, and event mapping structure or techniques that you can use. For fallacies, the main ones that we see are fallacies of relevance, omission, and assumption. And then our biases that we typically see, the four main ones there: culture, organizational, personal, and cognitive biases. So with that was a lot of information, but look at everything we just worked through there. We discussed those three thinking abilities, the types of reasoning, the different structured analytical techniques, what it means to truly be a critical thinker, and we talked about fallacies and biases. As always, if you have any questions about what you just learned in this lesson, please first reach out to your own ROTC instructor. Maybe find an MS4 or even a high-speed MS3 that might be able to walk this through with you. If you still can't get your questions answered, feel free to reach out to me at silver.beatty@mso.umt.edu. Thank you.